Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to the farm. Welcome to Volume 7 of our series on Why Stanley Kubrick. For the last couple of episodes, I've been talking all about The Shining, and thinking back, I would not have expected it to turn out that way. I would have expected to talk mostly about 2001, A Space Odyssey. But something strange is happening to me as I get older. My taste in films hasn't changed, and you would think that I would be getting more okay with long movies, but I think as I'm getting older, I'm starting to see I probably shouldn't be spending my last few decades, if I'm lucky, sitting through 3.5-hour epics that may or may not be worth it. And as I've gotten older, I suppose my personal ranking of 2001 has drifted downward over the years. That's not to say that The Shining is my favorite Stanley Kubrick film. As I've said before, I actually think Full Metal Jacket is a better film. But there's tons of information about The Shining out there. So there's a lot to get through. There's a lot that people would expect you to talk about. Also, it might be, believe it or not, his most fun movie. Now that's really saying a lot. That really tells you a lot about his vibe and the kind of movies he makes when you can say that The Shining is his most laid-back and accessible film. Laid back and accessible are not two terms that people would generally use for The Shining. But here we are, talking about The Shining. It's also a really fascinating movie because it might be his most intensely human or psychological movie. It's definitely the only movie where you can really dig into the characters and talk about controversies or theories about their behaviors and motivations and what they know and what they're seeing in the story. I would say in most of his films, the human element is not nearly that consequential. I mean, in 2001, all the humans are sort of just along for the ride, and then they do simple brute tasks to try to stay alive at the end. I suppose Dave Bowman's act of bravery when he goes out to encounter the monolith orbiting Jupiter all by himself, that's heroic. And it would have meant a lot more to the audience to see Dave Bowman take that plunge into the wormhole without knowing where he was headed, if we knew anything about Dave Bowman. He's sort of just stamped out generic human male astronaut scientist jock guy. The engineer athlete, which was the template for the early astronauts in the 1960s. And in another episode, we talked a lot about Neil Armstrong and how he definitely fit that mold. But having a very skillful astronaut that you can root for in a film, I guess like in The Martian, can only take you so far in terms of emotion. And The Shining definitely gives us a lot of emotion. Now, in this episode, I promise, we're definitely going to talk a lot about theories and a little bit about characters. There are some technical things that still remain to be discussed. Like, for example, we still haven't talked about how Kubrick shot the hallway filling with blood scene. How the heck did he do that? Did he actually rob a hospital or something, Fight Club style, in order to get all the blood he needed? Because, of course, he would be insistent on the fact that it would have to be actual human blood, because the audience could tell the difference. No, it wasn't real blood, although Kubrick did expend a lot of energy making sure that the color and the consistency was correct, because it definitely couldn't just be water. So, of course, that made this substance expensive to create and difficult to clean up. And if you're guessing that it took more than one take, you're right. And if you're guessing that it required a ton of preparation and setup between takes, especially cleaning up all that fake blood, then you'd be right. And I have heard mention from production assistants talking about the making of The Shining, who said that Kubrick, after taking days, and in the first case, weeks, to set up the shot, and planning how the fake blood would hit the furniture in the hallway and cause them to shift, and agonizing over the exact frame rate that would look the best, Kubrick had this sort of sealed tube that on the inside was designed to look like a hallway in the Overlook Hotel. He had this thing rigged with pumps that would force huge amounts of the artificial blood through the cracks in the elevator doors. These production assistants said that when it was time to actually roll and pull the trigger on this giant apparatus and see what kind of shot they could get, they said that when it was time to actually call action, Kubrick had to step away. He couldn't look at what was happening inside that tube. He would just content himself with agonizing over the footage after it was developed, because if he didn't like it, it was going to take days to get another shot at it. And as far as I can tell, Kubrick only did it 3 times. And if you've been keeping track, you might be breathing a sigh of relief. And before we move on to the first theory, let's talk a little bit about the "Here's Johnny" scene, which is probably the most famous scene in the film. That took apparently about 30 takes, depending on how you count. Some people say more, but I think 30 takes is a good number because that was associated with the number of doors that had to be kept on set so that some carpenters could reattach a new door in between shots for Jack Nicholson to chop through with his axe. And lucky for Jack Nicholson, he had worked as a firefighter at some point earlier in his life, and so he was fairly efficient at creating a hole in the door without a whole lot of wasted effort. And so, why did we need 30 takes? Well, first of all, it's a very important scene. It's essentially the climax of the movie, and there are a lot of moving parts that have to come together perfectly. He was trying to capture lightning in a bottle, as I said in the last volume. If you watch the scene, you'll notice that the camera will have perfect focus on Nicholson's face, and then as he starts to swing the axe blade is perfectly in focus, and the camera effortlessly follows the axe blade into the door. You'll see the camera move to the right really quickly, and then stop when the axe blade makes contact with the door. And boy, is that hard to do. Especially when you've got an actor who, in between shots, is jumping up and down, yelling, "Axe murderer! Axe murderer!" over and over and over again, with the axe in his hand, bouncing like a boxer, in order to keep his emotions turned up to 11. Then, inside the bathroom, Shelley Duvall is in the corner, and she apparently had to drink a lot of water because she was getting dehydrated from crying all day. Then, of course, whenever you're using an axe to chop through a door, you're going to have some unpredictable factors. The door will splinter in unpredictable ways, regardless of how well you plan the axe movements. And I imagine that Kubrick wanted a particular kind of opening in the door, because it would need to match with the door hole that they're going to put his face through for the "Here's Johnny" close-up. And it appears that they had a camera running inside the bathroom also. I'm sure that all of the axe chopping and then the "Here's Johnny" shot were not all one take. Even though that one camera only had the job of getting Jack Nicholson's close-up when he put his face through the door, that's still tricky. Technically a tricky shot to do. His face is going to be moving from one kind of lighting to a completely different kind of lighting, and the focus puller is going to have to be really on his toes. I do want to add that Kubrick wanted some pickup shots of just Shelley Duvall in the bathroom after Jack Nicholson had wrapped his shooting. And in the documentary, you can very clearly see Shelley Duvall's complete lack of enthusiasm at the idea of having to crouch in that corner and cry for another several hours. So, long story short, all of the exhaustion and the frayed nerves that you see with these characters is both completely real. It was being experienced in real life by the actors on the actual set. Now, I do have to mention that "Here's Johnny," that line was improvised by Jack Nicholson. Kubrick wanted Jack Nicholson to try different things when he poked his head through the door. One of the rare cases where Kubrick allowed improvising, especially for a critical scene. And so, apparently, in the novel The Shining, and in the 1997 miniseries, that was much more faithful to Stephen King's novel. When Jack Torrance chops through the door, he pokes his face through and he looks at Wendy and he says, "Boo." Just based on what I've already talked about, most listeners would know that that wouldn't fly. It's not weird enough. It's not creepy or out of left field. The strange thing is that the line itself is getting a little bit dated, because 1980 was pretty much the peak of the popularity of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. That show played right after the late news that followed prime time, 5 days a week, and at the beginning of every episode, right before Johnny Carson came out from behind the curtains, Johnny Carson's wingman and announcer, Ed McMahon, would say, "Here's Johnny." Now, Jack Torrance, presumably, like Jack Nicholson, is actually named John. So this "Here's Johnny" thing works because that's Jack Torrance's actual name. And it's creepy because it's supposed to be kind of an everyday, relaxing, funny thing that most Americans would experience throughout the week, watching The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. So the line worked really well in America, but Kubrick didn't know what the hell Jack Nicholson was talking about. Kubrick just thought he was referring to Jack's real name and thought it was just a weird thing to say, and he liked it. And then later when people told him, "Hey, that's what Ed McMahon says at the beginning of every episode of The Tonight Show," Kubrick was like, "Oh, okay, well then it'll hit even harder in the US. It works still without knowing who Johnny Carson is, for the same reason that it worked for Kubrick on set in 1979 when he first heard "Here's Johnny," and he liked it, but it did not ring a bell with him that was from The Tonight Show, because he had been living almost exclusively in Britain for almost a decade now. And so he was falling out of alignment with American pop culture. What a tragedy. I suppose Jack Torrance poking his face through the door and yelling, "Here's Johnny," in a world with no Tonight Show would be kind of like me chasing my wife Katie with an axe, yelling, "It's a me! It's a Vincenzo!" That would be creepy because it doesn't sound like me, and it sounds like I'm possessed by some strange Italian man, or I'm just sticking to a joke, a bad bit, for way too long. In any case, it's unsettling, and that's what Kubrick wanted. He wanted unsettling. He wanted cinematic. He wanted it to be weird. He wanted the audience to feel stalked or attacked or just plain uncomfortable. And he accomplished that not just through the acting or the dialogue, but also using a few technical tricks that we'll have to talk about. But I promised we'd talk theories. So before we move on to infrasound, we'll talk about one of the theories. Then we'll go back and talk about something super technical that will bore the shit out of everyone. But it's kind of important. It has to do with the soundtrack and tones that Kubrick added that are scientifically demonstrated to make people feel anxious and uncomfortable. And as we'll see, Stephen King in particular had some negative things to say about that. Okay, so let's trot out the first theory about The Shining. Let's do an easy one. Think of this as sort of an aperitif, something easy to digest just to get us going, so that I can go back to talking about frequencies and sound and other boring stuff. The subject of the first theory might sound familiar to some of my more dedicated listeners, and that is the MK Ultra theory. What's interesting is that this is Stanley Kubrick's second film that explicitly covers mind control. If this theory is to be considered true, I'm going to go ahead and say that even though MK Ultra is one of my pet subjects, I don't think that The Shining is really about MK Ultra. If anything, you could say that A Clockwork Orange is a comment about MK Ultra, even though strangely, A Clockwork Orange coming out in 1971 would have come out well after MK Ultra started, but well before it was revealed to the public. So, was he just a good guesser? Or did he have his eyes and his ears open, and he had some clue as to what might be really going on behind the scenes? I think Dr. Strangelove showed his grim view of human governments in general. I have to add that one of the founders, James Madison, once wrote that if men were angels, then no government would be necessary. I think he has a point, and an important one, because the odd irony of government is that it's an activity conducted by fallible humans, but they're given enormous authority over human affairs. So you gotta put in all sorts of watchdog functions and vetting of appointed officials, rules for elected officials. But unfortunately, I think what we know about the deep state and what we know about the military-industrial complex alerts us to the fact that our government substantially changed in the mid-20th century. We've already covered theories as to what changed exactly and why. And speaking of governments being operated by fallible humans, what was MK Ultra all about? Well, as I'd mentioned before, it was about mind control. It was about manipulating the human mind against the subject's will in a way that would make them a compliant spy or assassin. They were also looking for ways to detect lies, and also ways to read minds, and to do this activity called remote viewing, where you can use your consciousness to locate objects. Sort of like an astral or immaterial bloodhound, sniffing for its target, its prey, through the psionic field. And supposedly, CIA-trained remote viewers have located a lot of important targets, like Soviet missile silos, or even those underwater UFO factories, operated by whatever or whoever controls the Greys. Of course, I also added that I think one of the most secret elements of MK Ultra, and I suspect the bulk of the records that were permanently destroyed in 1974, had to do with developing psionic abilities that would allow humans to guide or influence alien or NHI technology. Okay, so what does this have to do with The Shining? I suspect a lot of you are already pretty skeptical about this theory. Let's talk about one of the first indicators of MK Ultra being the actual subject of The Shining. Early in the film, in the Torrance's apartment, before Jack gets the job at the Overlook Hotel, we see Wendy sitting in her kitchen and reading a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. Okay, what does The Catcher in the Rye have to do with MK Ultra? Well, we're not exactly sure. The subject matter of the book has been described by one insightful YouTuber as, quote, an edgelord's dream, end quote. I, like many people, was forced to debase my mind by dragging it through this adolescent slop. The frustration of a young person that's starting to see that there's a hierarchy and an unfair sort of mechanism that's really derived from economic necessity and political necessity. But the subject of this episode is not the nature of the phoniness or the phony people that are constantly discussed in The Catcher in the Rye. But this book is associated with MK Ultra in a very tenuous way because in the early 80s, a man named John Hinckley Jr. tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan. And he was a suspected Manchurian candidate, someone who was suspected of being a brainwashed candidate suspect. Let me rephrase that. He was suspected of having been brainwashed, Manchurian candidate style, in order to robotically carry out an assassination against his own will when a trigger word or some sort of other psychological stimulus is applied. It could be seeing a particular image, or hearing a particular phrase, or reading a particular phrase. And here's where The Catcher in the Rye comes in. Shortly after the attempted assassination, when the FBI tracked down John Hinckley Jr., they found him in a hotel room. And in that hotel room, there was a copy of, you guessed it, The Catcher in the Rye, and no other books. Okay, well gosh, how does this relate to the Overlook Hotel, actually? Is this theory really just based on The Catcher in the Rye? Well, the theory claims that the Overlook Hotel is a CIA front. It's a place where they can get compromat on important people, similar to operations directed by people with names like Diddy or Epstein. And this would explain a lot of the odd things that Wendy sees, like the two apparitions in the room, one wearing a tuxedo and the other one on his or her knees while wearing a cute, fuzzy, furry bear suit. But that wasn't all. The Overlook was also a place where the CIA could run psychological experiments on guests by putting drugs in their food or water, which would be very easy because they knew that the Torrances would only have one source of food. All of the cereal and milk and lamb shanks and steaks that Dick Halloran showed Wendy at the beginning of the film. So the goal of MK Ultra was to create assassins. Assassins that normally wouldn't kill and had no animosity toward their targets, but they would just do what they were programmed to do. And now we can see the connection, I think. Because clearly, in this framework for The Shining, you could say that the CIA was setting up Jack as their target, the subject of their experiment, to see whether they could use the influence of their drugs to cause Jack to murder his family against his own will. Their thought was that if you could reliably take control of a man's mind and force him to kill his own family, well then you could definitely create reliable assassins to muster in the fight against the Soviet Union. So what other clues did Kubrick leave for us to figure this out, other than the Catcher in the Rye, which is a really obvious kind of ham-fisted clue? Just kidding. The other clues aren't much better. In the rec room, near the beginning of the film, where Danny first sees the Grady twins, there's a poster on the wall in some of the shots, and the poster is primarily a photo of someone skiing, which makes sense, given the location. But then underneath the photo, we see the word monarch. M-O-N-A-R-C-H. Monarch. It just so happens that Monarch was an alternate name or an alias for the MK Ultra program. Also, according to this theory, this guy Bill Watson, who we meet at the beginning of the film at Jack Torrance's job interview, but you have to watch this guy Bill Watson. He is always hanging around. He doesn't seem to have a specific function. He just follows and listens. And whenever Mr. Ullman instructs him to help Jack Torrance carry something or do some other menial task, Bill Watson looks annoyed. And in particular, in the job interview scene, when Ullman first mentions the Charles Grady, aka Delbert Grady story, Bill Watson has a very alert and concerned look on his face, and he's watching Jack Torrance very carefully. Now, if the theory were true, and the Overlook was set up as some sort of sadistic CIA experiment, where they are planting this idea of murdering his family in Jack Torrance's mind, the drugs will do their work after they've sort of planted this idea in his head. It is true that MK Ultra was in the news around the time that The Shining was published. Stephen King may have heard something about it while he was writing The Shining. I think it's kind of doubtful that the novel has anything to do with the CIA, especially since the novel is a lot more explicit about what's happening in the characters' minds. So MK Ultra may not have been on Stephen King's radar, but by the time Kubrick was writing his script, MK Ultra had been all over the news for years. But I still don't buy it. We'll talk about which theory I think holds the most water. But, unfortunately, before we get there, remember our deal. I can't let you crawfish on our deal now. We gotta talk about sound, and in particular, infrasound. And along the way, we'll find out why Stephen King said that The Shining was a movie designed to attack the audience. So if we're going to talk about infrasound, we have to review what sound is. Sound is really a repetitive compression of some sort of material, like air or water. And sound travels through materials and fluids at different rates. So there are two principal characteristics of a sound. The first one is its amplitude, which is how loud is it? How much is it compressing the fluid? The second and really important one is the frequency. How quickly does the compression happen? How rapidly does one compression follow the one before? So the weird thing is that what we perceive as high-pitched tones, like musical notes, that's how our brain interprets thumping or tapping that is occurring faster than our brain can keep track of. And I think that's weird. I think it's weird that if you thump or tap something fast enough, the sound becomes a musical tone instead of just thumping. Now, how fast do you have to tap or thump before the tapping becomes a tone? It's somewhere around 30 times a second. Now, if you really want to blare out a clear, standard musical tone, like, say, I guess the second A above middle C is 440 taps or pulses per second. And what do I mean by taps or pulses? If you had some sort of superhuman whose heart beat 220 times every second, their chest would hum. It would hum a musical note that would be the first A above middle C. So how do we measure frequency? Frequency is measured in hertz. A hertz is a measurement of frequency. It's literally just how many times something happens in 1 second. So if a light is flashing at 10 hertz, that means it flashes 10 times in 1 second. And if something only happens once every 2 seconds, that would be 0.5 hertz, half a hertz. So 440 hertz sounds like this. 220 hertz would also be the note A, but 1 octave lower. And it sounds like this. Below this, we have the very important musical tone, middle C, and middle C is 126.625525 hertz. So almost 127 pulses per second. But if you were to do 127, say if you were singing, then you would be a tiny bit sharp. And so here's middle C. Now let's get way low. Let's fall down into the 2-digit hertz numbers. So here's another A note, but a much lower one. This is at 55 hertz. And now, as you'll hear, we're getting close to where the subwoofers will kick on, which is at 40 hertz. But here is 55 hertz. Okay, so you can hear that we're starting to get very bassy, very low. And it's getting harder to hear, even though all of these tones have the exact same amplitude. That's important to note. This is due to the limits of human hearing. Now let's drop it down by half, another octave, again, to an even lower A. And this one is at 27.5 hertz. And this is just above the lower limit of human hearing, which is 20 hertz. So 27.5 hertz sounds like this. Okay, now for the last one, we're going to play some infrasound. Now, this is an even lower A, but it's getting to the point where we're not perceiving it as a musical note anymore. This is 13.75 hertz. So just under 14 hertz. And remember, anything below 20 hertz is considered infrasound. And bear in mind, we're using the same amplitude, which was pretty loud. Now, depending on your sound system, some of you didn't hear anything at all. So this kind of infrasound was placed in many parts of The Shining soundtrack. This creates a muddy, ominous sound. Kubrick was very particular about the sounds. As I mentioned before, he tried to get as much good natural sound from the set as possible, which is something that's attainable, especially when you're shooting everything on a soundstage. Yet another reason to shoot on a soundstage: complete control not only over the light, but also over sounds. Now, there was one interesting case where Kubrick was going to get rid of a natural sound from the set. And it's a good thing he didn't, because that sound has become iconic. So during the shots where Danny is riding his tricycle, we hear the real sounds of the tricycle wheels going over the carpet, then the hardwood floors, and then the carpet again. Kubrick was tempted to have the ominous music score and that infrasound dubbed over the smooth Steadicam shots of Danny riding his tricycle. According to one story that was told, another famous director, a German national, Werner Herzog, also known as Werner Herzog, he was on the set, and apparently he was the one who convinced Kubrick to keep the natural noise of the tricycle in the shot, which I think was a very good decision. It really grounds you in the reality of what's happening, and you really get into what Danny is doing right before you're confronted with the twins.
Hello, Vincent. Come and podcast with us, Vincent. You can talk forever and ever and ever.
Well, I know you guys would love another 20 minutes of me talking about sound engineering and how to measure frequencies and what they mean, but we got to keep it moving, unfortunately. Sorry about that. We're going to have to deal with this bald, bearded old man who's doing weird stuff and testing everybody's patience. And no, I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about Stanley Kubrick. So now let's talk about continuity. That's the effort that filmmakers make to make sure that all the shots match, that all the furniture is in the same place, the wallpaper doesn't change, nor the hairstyle or costumes of the actors. There's a couple of shots in a Brian De Palma film, The Untouchables, starring Kevin Costner and Sean Connery, and Robert De Niro as Al Capone. There was a conversation between Sean Connery's character and Kevin Costner's character. And in one shot, you see that his collar is buttoned and he's wearing a tie. And then in the very next shot, a fraction of a second later, there's Sean Connery with no tie and the top button of his collar unbuttoned. Once you see it, it's kind of jarring, but I've seen that movie 100 times on VHS, and I never noticed it until I saw a breakdown of the movie on YouTube, like in the 2010s or something. Now that's a pretty big continuity error, but most movies are full of smaller mistakes that only cinephile weirdos will notice. So I just said that every movie has its share of continuity problems. And if you're going to guess that Kubrick's movies have far fewer, then you'd be right. That's the weird context in which we find The Shining. The Shining is stuffed full of continuity problems. And they're not small errors. They're big, glaring ones. And just on the face of that statement, we can guess that maybe Kubrick was doing this on purpose. We've got direct eyewitness evidence of this. We know for a fact that Kubrick would deliberately change things on set between shots. So we have the testimony of people who were on the set saying that Kubrick would say, "Hold on a second," and he'd step onto the set and he'd move a chair. He would remove a refrigerator magnet. So they definitely weren't accidental. And as you recall from a previous episode, we talked about the famous carpet pattern and how Kubrick reversed the pattern now and then. So why was Kubrick doing this? I think trying to understand why Kubrick wanted to create these problems gets us closer to what Kubrick was aiming for as far as how he wanted people to think about or interpret the story. If you want to get a sense of the kind of effect these continuity errors have on the audience, you can watch the scene where Wendy interrupts Jack while he's quote-unquote working, and he berates her for interrupting him and distracting him. And of course, in a previous volume, my wife and I tried to reenact that scene, and we ran into some difficulties dealing with the director. But if you go back and watch that scene, and you keep looking over Jack Nicholson's right shoulder, against the wall behind him, there's a wooden chair. And that wooden chair keeps disappearing and coming back, and disappearing and coming back. So my theory is that Kubrick is trying to introduce an element of an unreliable narrator. Pretty much every character in the story is being psychologically affected or traumatized or possessed. No one in the film is in a good emotional state, except maybe Dick Halloran through most of the movie. He's pretty much okay anytime he's not having one of his shining seizures. Some people point to these continuity problems, and they say that this supports a theory that's come to be called the Wendy theory. The best way to sum up the Wendy theory is that the whole movie is just in her head. She's making the whole thing up, and something else happened to Jack. Who knows? Maybe she locked him out of the hotel. Maybe the blow to the head was extreme. I don't know. I think you're already starting to see problems here, because so much of the movie doesn't have Wendy in it. It's not from her point of view. If you're going to choose a point of view for the story, it seems like you would pick Jack, and then maybe Danny would be your second choice. Wendy is also the person who appears to be the least affected by the Overlook Hotel. She's anxious and tired of dealing with the emotional disturbances going on in the minds of the other two people she's got to deal with for 5 months. So I don't buy the Wendy theory. Another strange continuity issue has to do with this Grady guy, the caretaker who supposedly axe-murdered his family during the winter of 1970 to 1971. So this was roughly 10 years before the events in the story. And if you recall from the job interview near the beginning of the movie, Mr. Ullman, the manager of the hotel, informs Jack Torrance about the terrible incident that happened 10 years before. And he says that a man named Charles Grady killed his family and then died by suicide. Then later, in the white and arterial red restroom, there Jack runs into another man named Grady, who's wearing a tuxedo and seems to be serving as some sort of waiter for the party. In fact, Jack Torrance refers to him as Jeevesy because he looks like some sort of formal butler or some other kind of servant. And as they talk in the bathroom, the man reveals that his name is Delbert. Delbert Grady. And so that's weird. What makes it even stranger is that Jack Torrance hears this and seems to accept it without any question or concern or confusion. So, what's his real name? Well, I checked to see what name was used in the novel. What name did Stephen King use? Well, the caretaker's name is Delbert Grady, all through the novel. And in the movie, only Mr. Ullman uses the name Charles in the job interview. So here's my theory. Delbert was sort of a nickname. Maybe Charles was his formal legal name. And as a former employer and someone who later made the national news, it seems that people started to go with his legal name. And there are some deleted scenes from The Shining that show Jack Torrance thumbing through old scrapbooks that he finds in the hotel, and he's reading up on the history of the hotel. My thought is that Jack not only knows that Charles Grady was also known as Delbert Grady, he also just recognizes Grady's face. When he sees this strange man in the tuxedo, he starts to call him Jeevesy. But then, it's clear that Jack Torrance feels some sort of sense of recognition. Now, one theory that's popular on the internet is that this Delbert Grady guy is a compilation or a combination or an amalgam of different people. And one bit of evidence that's put forth as evidence for this theory is that this spirit that Jack Torrance is talking to in the restroom is kind of part Charles Grady, but part Delbert, somebody else, and I guess maybe the Overlook itself? Some kind of spirit blending? I don't buy it. Now, one thing that's weird about this Delbert Grady guy is that Charles Grady apparently, supposedly, did his terrible act in 1970. Now, if he was supposed to be the caretaker of the hotel, he was not going to be an elderly man. We could suppose that maybe he was a member of the silent generation. But there's some weird, anachronistic things about him. There are things about Delbert that don't make sense if the axe murdering happened in 1970. The first thing is that the two little girls in the powder blue dresses that are presumably the Grady twins, Ullman said that the Grady daughters were 8 and 10 years old, respectively, which completely rules out the possibility that they were twins. And I don't think their wardrobe matches, or their hairstyles. These do not look like little girls from 1970. Young people dressed quite differently by that point. These girls look like they're from the 30s or 40s. Now we come to the second reason why Delbert Grady seems like he comes from some older time. And we could say that this older time is presumably the 1920s, because that's the setting of the psychotic hallucination that Jack Torrance is having when he meets Delbert Grady. And then Delbert says something that is shocking to very late 20th century people, and especially 21st century people, but was used all the time in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And of course, I'm talking about the N-word. Delbert Grady says that N-word with gusto. And boy, does he hit that hard R at the end. So if this Grady guy was the caretaker of the hotel just 10 years before, wouldn't Mr. Ullman have known this Grady guy personally? This is something that I've wondered for a while when I watched the job interview scene. And then also, let's think about that weird guy, Watson, the guy who hardly says anything and just sort of stares at Jack Torrance the whole time. I wonder how long he's been there. Maybe he knew Charles, a.k.a. Delbert Grady. And maybe that's why he looks so weird while they're talking about the story. It hits a little different with him. But we don't know that. The one person whose career timeline at the Overlook that we have clear information about is good old Dick Halloran. In the novel, Halloran started at the Overlook 6 years earlier, which means Halloran was hired after the Grady incident. So Dick Halloran didn't know Charles Grady. And so let's talk a minute about this Delbert Grady guy, the ghost in the gold room in the tuxedo who spills that disgusting egg liqueur on his jacket. So, as we all know, they go into that weird bathroom, and Jack Torrance recognizes Delbert, and they have kind of a weird conversation. And a lot of people might remember an especially shocking part of the conversation, where this caretaker ghost, Delbert Grady, starts talking about Danny, how Danny was trying to contact somebody so they could come and save Danny and Wendy from Jack's attempt for some red rum. And so the caretaker, Delbert Grady, he says to Jack Torrance, "Do you know that your son is attempting to bring an outside party into this situation?" And Jack says, "No, I wasn't aware of that." And Delbert definitely lets Jack Torrance know who he's talking about. But he says it in a way that's a little shocking and ugly. Delbert Grady is not only fond of axe murder, he's also very fond of the N-word. And just like with his axe murder, he takes care to, in the words of Mr. Ullman, stack the bodies up like cordwood. So he pays attention to detail. And likewise, with the same attention to detail and thoroughness, Delbert Grady definitely uses that hard R. He leans into it. So we're going to talk about this conversation, this exchange, for a little bit here, because I want to explore what kind of clues it might give us to what's really going on here. And so since we have to talk about that particular exchange, instead of using the N-word, I'm going to use a convention that I've seen on the internet that seems to work pretty well. So instead of the N-word, for the rest of the episode, I'm going to use the word ninja instead. So, how does Delbert Grady describe Dick Halloran when Delbert is trying to warn Jack Torrance that his own son might be trying to foil his murder plot? How dare that little kid? And so he tells Jack Torrance that a ninja cook is attempting to interfere with the situation. And this phrase hits probably a little harder now than it did in 1980. But even back then, it felt kind of out of the blue. Now, this phrase, ninja cook, is specifically used in Stephen King's book. So Stephen King thought it was instructive or important, and then Stanley Kubrick also thought it was important. And so why? Why were they so on about using the word ninja? I mean, are Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick just closet racists who get a lot of joy from making people say the word ninja on screen over and over again? In other words, are they like Quentin Tarantino? You could probably have a verb, to Tarantino someone. And so to Tarantino someone is where the script and the director forces the actor to either A, say the word ninja, or B, show their feet. If you do a Tarantino movie, those are the two options. So no, I don't think Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick just liked the word ninja. It's there for a reason. And so what is that? Well, it does match the age of the rest of the party. And here we've gotten to the central issue, which is that this Delbert Grady guy really seems to come from the 1920s. He's in the Gold Room party, which is clearly a Prohibition-era party. He's in an old-school tuxedo. He's serving old drinks. So I think the enthusiastic use of the phrase ninja cook is designed to give us a hint of what era this ghost is coming from. And as 21st century Americans, we're going to focus on the racism, but there's something else there. If you listen, he says the word cook with the same contempt and derision, almost, that he used for the word ninja. So he really seems to not like either one. And then this person is a combination of the two, and he has the nerve to try to interfere. That's the vibe we're getting. And so not only do we have racism, we have classism, which really feels like early 20th century, more 1920s than 1980s. And so I think this phrase is actually key to understanding the movie, strangely enough, because my theory that I'll talk about much later on is that this story has psychological impact and staying power because I think on a sort of abstract, allegorical level, the hotel represents the moral crimes of American history. It's built on the blood guilt of the North American continent. And Dick Halloran said that some places shine and some places don't. And I think that the phrase ninja cook is an auditory, in-your-face example of America shining, quote unquote. And have bad things happened in America in our history? Yeah, lots of stuff. And so there's a little hint about what I think The Shining really means. I don't think it's about MK Ultra. And unfortunately, we'll have to save the Holocaust and Apollo 11 for the next go-round. But just know that The Shining involves the psychological effects of isolation, repetition, solitude. And then there's the mundane marriage problems between Jack and Wendy. But I think ultimately, The Shining is about a bad place. It's a place that's haunted, and it seems to want people to do bad things, especially to each other. A place where a lot of rich people have had a lot of fun, and a lot of poor people have slaved away in kitchens to make sure that that fun was the funnest it could be. And when they were done making the fun, their exhausted, broken bodies are dumped into mass graves. Doesn't sound like anywhere I know. Nowhere on this planet do people feel like that. Just like the song says, everything's awesome. Now, I do want to add that the United States is not unique in terms of having terrible things in its past. All the stuff I said about the North American continent could be said 10,000 times over for an old, haunted place like Europe or China or Egypt. So, The Shining is not an anti-American story. It's a particularly American view on the American past. In the novel, the Overlook is utterly isolated, up on a mountain, inaccessible most of the time to most of the world. We're isolated, and people from other countries come here and they're kind of shocked at how much we just are concerned about our own continent, about our own business, with a few glaring exceptions, but that's another big giant can of worms we won't open. Well, I think that's about it for today. Next time, we'll talk about a few more technical items. We got to talk a little bit more about the Steadicam, a little bit more about artificial snow. Then we'll talk about the release and the reception of the movie, and a big battle that Stanley Kubrick waged over the look of the movie poster, the one sheet. What would the title look like? What would be on the poster? If you check out the movie now, it's usually Jack Nicholson's face poking through that door. But that's a major spoiler. So in 1980, when it was released, they weren't going to use that image. So we'll talk about what they did instead. We'll talk about the theory that there are no ghosts in The Shining, We'll talk about demons, a bit of demonic symbolism in the story. We'll talk about Apollo 11. So we'll have to talk a little bit more physics for that. Then we'll have to talk about the Holocaust, everyone's favorite subject. Then, of course, we'll finish with the fact that the hotel is built on a Native American burial ground. Suffice it to say, I think the Native American genocide angle holds a lot of water. Mr. Ullman tells Jack that the hotel was built on a Native American burial ground. And not only that, he says that the people who settled there first had to fight off Native American attacks. So it's underlined in red ink, basically, for the audience. And so that's what we'll do next time. So I promise that the next episode will be tedious, sad, disappointing. I mean, I'm looking at the script for it, and I gotta tell you, it's not looking good. So, apologies in advance. And until next time, talk to you later.